Hey folks, welcome back to the Law of Self-Defense YouTube channel. I was recently fortunate enough to be interviewed at length by Rich Brown of the American Warrior Society on his weekly show, Coffee with Rich. Over the course of that roughly hour-and-a-half interview, Rich and I discussed a wide variety of self-defense law-related topics and cases, including the Kyle Rittenhouse case, the Ahmaud Arbery case, the Jacob Blake case, the Rayshard Brooks case, the George Zimmerman case, as well as various political dynamics around many of these high-profile self-defense cases. In addition to providing the video of this interview in its full length here, because of the length of the interview, I'm also planning to make selected portions of it available as shorter YouTube videos focused on particular points of interest. If you've come here from one of those shorter video segments, thanks, and I hope you enjoyed the full interview as much as you apparently did the segment that led you here. Before we dive in, I'll make the universal ask that is always made on YouTube videos, that if you like our content, be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, and click the bell to be sure to get notifications every time we upload more such content to the Law of Self-Defense YouTube channel. Okay, folks, with that introduction out of the way, here's the full-length video of my October 1st, 2021 interview by Rich Brown of the American Warrior Society. Enjoy. The Law of Self-Defense content you are about to enjoy is presented for general educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice. If you are in need of legal advice, consult competent legal counsel in the relevant jurisdiction.
All right, we are live. Good morning on another Friday morning edition of Coffee with Rich. And this morning I'm joined by my friend Andrew Branca, who is attorney at law, Esquire. 23 folks joining us live. Please like and hit that share button. I'm going to go ahead and read Andrew's bio, but I'm sure everybody knows who he is. Attorney Andrew Branca, Esquire, is in his third decade of practicing law, specializing in self-defense law in the United States, where he is an internationally recognized expert through his legal practice, Law of Self-Defense, LLC. Andrew helps law-abiding armed citizens make better informed, more confident, more decisive decisions in defense of themselves, their families, and their property. Andrew is an occasional guest instructor and subject matter expert on self-defense law at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Academy at Quantico, and the Sig Sauer Academy. Has been the legal expert co-host on the Outdoor Channel's enormously popular TV show, The Best Defense. Andrew also teaches other lawyers how to argue self-defense cases as a certified instructor with a continuing legal education system in the majority of states around the country. In addition to his legal work, Andrew is also an NRA Life member and certified instructor, an IDPA charter life member. His IDPA number is 13. That's incredibly impressive. And a masterclass competitor in multiple IDPA disciplines. You can find more at lawofselfdefense.com. We're going to be talking about some of Andrew's products as well as the many cases that are coming up today. Andrew, thank you for coming on to the show.
Very happy to be here. I should mention, too, I'm also a member, of course, of the American Warrior Society. I apologize. I forgot my coin number. It's on the shelf behind me in my office, but trust me, I'm a member.
Well, thank you for being a member, sir. Let's start off. What does your bio overlook, Andrew? That impressive bio.
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, a ton of stuff, but mostly what people listening to this show should be aware of is just what we do on a daily basis here, which is inform people about self-defense law as it applies to real people in real use of force events all around the country, all 50 states. We cover all the high-profile cases in great detail. Usually we cover them moment by moment over the course of the trials as they're being televised. We'll be doing that for the Ahmaud Arbery trial and for the Kyle Rittenhouse trials coming up. Of course, we did it for the Derek Chauvin trial, just like we did it for the George Zimmerman trial and any of these trials. So if people want to know what's actually happening in those trials, folks, the media's reports are not going to help you. I apologize if there's any journalists in the crowd today, but most of these journalists have no idea what they're talking about. They couldn't identify the key points in the trial if they wanted to, and mostly they don't want to. Mostly they have a pre-decided narrative they're pushing anyway. So to my knowledge, the only way to really understand what's happening in these trials is to take advantage of our coverage. Usually our coverage is free. Most of the content we produce on a day-to-day basis is for Law of Self-Defense members. But when we cover these high-profile cases, both because of the public interest nature of the case, And often we have sponsors who make it possible for us to provide our coverage in an open access format. And that's true for these upcoming trials too. So, for example, CCW Safe is sponsoring our coverage of the Arbery trials and the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. So we'll be able to make our coverage of those trials available on an open access basis.
Yeah. And before we get into some of because I do want to talk about Ahmaud Arbery and perhaps Derek Chauvin and some of the other things that are going on right now. But I want to talk a little bit about your products and some of the consumables that you offer that are absolutely amazing. Thank you to the 31 folks joining us. Please like and hit that share button. You know, I'm a member of your consult program, as well as I got a dog-eared copy of your book on my bedside table, as I've mentioned several times before, because Rich Brown doesn't want to spend the rest of his life in prison. And at the same time, I don't want to be timid when it comes to using force to save myself or my family. And I, better informed is the way to go. So tell us about your products, Andrew.
Well, we have DVD courses on the law of self-defense. It's like an 8-hour or maybe 12 hours of content, very long course, longer than when we teach the course live, because we don't have the time constraints on a DVD that we do in the live class. Then separately, we have state-specific supplement courses, again, on DVD. And all the DVD stuff is also available, streamed online, instant access, all that jazz. So these specific self-defense laws for whatever state you might be interested in. We have an instructor program for people who actually, unfortunately, there's very few places for even well-intentioned self-defense firearms instructors to really learn the actual law of self-defense. You're not really taught that. I'm an NRA instructor myself, and I know they didn't teach me any of this stuff in a meaningful way. But frankly, what we prefer to do is give people the lowest cost option to get exposed to what we do. And then if they want to get more costly courses or instructor program access, they can do that. That's up to them. But we have our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense. We basically make that available for free. If you go to Amazon and buy it, they'll charge you $25 in shipping and handling. But if you go to lawofselfdefense.com/free book, we just ask that you cover the shipping and handling, so we don't have to pay the postal service to get the book to you. But the $25 cost of the book, we eat. So you can get the book for just the cost of shipping and handling at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. And as far as our membership content, we make available a 2-week trial membership for 99 cents. If you don't like it, we'll refund 200% of your money. It's double 99 cents. It's not a lot of money, but we didn't ask for a lot up front. The point is we wanted to make it a negative risk opportunity, and you get the same access as a normal paying member. There's no limitation on accessing our content. So for 2 weeks for 99 cents, you can be a Law of Self-Defense member, decide if it's for you. If you stay a member, it's only about $0.25 a day, folks. So it's not super expensive, less than $10 a month. And you can take advantage of that 2-week trial at lawofselfdefense.com/trial. And I'll put that in the comments too for people to see.
Thanks, Andrew. And what about your consult program?
So I almost get shy talking about the consult program because it's a more substantial investment in resources than the things I just mentioned, the book and the membership. But given the demands on our time, unfortunately, the only cases that we can consult on these days, that we can be a legal advisor on, are for members of our consult program. So the consult program is a higher level of membership. I think it's $40 or $50 a month. But those are the only cases we provide our legal services to now, because we just don't have, we get hundreds of inquiries. And I wouldn't have time to do anything else. And the truth is, I love consulting on these cases. It's real nuts and bolts legal work, but it's probably the least productive use of my time in my office, because when I'm doing blog posts or I'm doing interviews like this, I'm reaching dozens or hundreds or thousands of people, helping them stay out of jail. When I consult on a case, it consumes 150% of my time for the duration of that case, and I'm helping one client. Now, it's a lot of help. We have an almost perfect record of getting charges dismissed, or at least the defendant getting put into a diversion program. So if they keep their nose clean for a certain period of time, the charges are dismissed. I'm very proud of our success rate, but we're just still helping that one person. And I prefer to use my time in a way that we can leverage it across multiple people. That said, if someone wants our legal consult services, they have to be a member of our Law of Self-Defense consult program, or we simply can't take the case. We just don't have the bandwidth. And if people want to learn about that, they can point their browser to lawofselfdefense.com/consult. And of course, we'd be happy if everyone became a member of the consult program. That would be great. But we, again, do encourage people to at least take advantage of the opportunity to get the book, the trial membership, to be a member, see what we do. And if you like what we do and you feel confident in the quality of our work product, then sure, I would encourage you to consider being a consult member.
Yeah, and as mentioned before, I am a consult member, a paying consult member. I think it's money well spent, in my opinion, because again, I've heard people make comments like that. You know, they're timid about using force to protect themselves, and I want to remove one of those barriers.
Yeah, we always tell people, the most important thing is winning the physical fight. If you don't win the physical fight, everything else is less pressing. Let's face it. But you don't want to win the physical fight in such a way that you end up spending the rest of your life in a cage. And folks, if you kill someone in self-defense and your claim of self-defense fails, you're looking at life in prison without possibility of early release. It's forever. So we want people to be able to make well-informed decisions in self-defense, know where those legal boundaries are, so they know when they're outside the boundaries, in which case they probably shouldn't be using force, but they also know when they're inside the boundaries and they can use that defensive force decisively to win that physical fight. So we really think that having a comprehensive understanding of these laws of self-defense, and they're not complicated, folks. There's only 5 elements, maximum of 5 elements to a claim of self-defense, but understanding where those legal lines are avoids that hesitation and allows you to act decisively in the physical fight as well.
Absolutely. And thank you to the 37 folks that are on with us this morning live, and to everyone that's going to listen to the podcast or watching the YouTube channel, Coffee with Rich. On that, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Rich Brown. I'm the co-host, co-founder of the American Warrior Society, American Warrior Show, America's #1 self-defense podcast. And I also should say I'm a retired Marine Corps officer, former police officer, corrections officer, etc. So having spent a year working in a prison, I know that I never want to go back and be stuck in a cage there, because I've seen what those conditions are like, and I want no part of that. Which is why having Andrew on is so important right now with everything going on in the world. But before we get into that, I want to talk about, there's been a lot of questions that continue to come up about being an instructor. And I think Seeklander and I we're going to end up teaching like 6 instructor classes this year. So it's on my mind a lot, Andrew. And I know that you have a great deal of instructor time. You've traveled around the country for years teaching self-defense law. In your opinion, sir, what makes a great instructor?
Oh, well, that's a multivariate question. I mean, the first thing, really, whatever is being taught is utter mastery of whatever it is you're teaching. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult in the self-defense community because it's the threshold to become certified as an instructor is basically 0. And I say that as someone who got my NRA certifications in pistol, rifle, and personal protection in one weekend in a training counselor's basement back in 1990 something. And when I walked out of there, I had certificates as an instructor in those 3 disciplines. And in hindsight, I knew nothing about any of those things except in the most superficial possible way. And that's an unfortunate reality. Now, in terms of just the basic safety stuff, let's face it, you can teach that to somebody in 15 minutes and they can teach that to other people, and that's all fine. And if these brand new spanking certified instructors were doing only that, kudos. That's fantastic. We want people to be safe with guns. But unfortunately, a lot of instructors get these basic superficial certifications and then hold themselves out as some kind of actual experts on these subjects. It takes years, folks, years and years to become an actual expert in these things, to be able to do these things. And more importantly, not just do them, but then have the skills to teach them, which is a completely different skill set entirely. There's lots of great shooters out there who are terrible instructors. But so you need to have both skill sets. You need to be able to do what you're teaching, or at least have had the ability to do what you're teaching. Sometimes I get a little pushback where people say, hey, when I was 20, I could do this. Now I'm 50 or 60. I'm not as bouncy as I used to be. Maybe the skills have degraded a little bit, and that's completely understandable. But if you never knew how to fire a gun accurately under time pressure, you ought not be teaching that to other people. If you had that skill, and maybe it's degraded a little bit with age, I'm older every day, just like everybody else. I get it. That's completely understandable. But at least at one point, you possessed the skill. You understood it and had mastered it. And that's fine. I don't have any objection to that. But if you've never actually done it, I mean, I see people teaching things they can't do. I mean, firearms instructors who can't shoot. They don't know how to actually run a gun. And they're out there in control of a firing line purporting to be teaching other people how to do this. And it's a travesty. It ought not be done. So master your subject matter. Master yourself first. And then also make sure you're developing good teaching skills. Now, I know the kind of instructor course teaching that you and Mike do, because I have Mike's book. I forget the title. It's up here on the shelf in my office. But it also teaches how to teach, not just the underlying skills themselves. And that's a very important skill set to have as well. And very complicated skill set. I saw TC is on here. He's a doctor of education. And he can attest, there's lots of ways to teach, and different students absorb information best in different ways. Frankly, my own form of teaching that I did for so many years, traveling 40, 45 weekends a year, teaching 2-day law self-defense classes. One of the reasons we started our membership program, where we were providing access on an almost daily basis, blog posts, video, audio, was because probably the worst way to learn what I teach is to sit for 2 days in a weekend in a class for 16 hours and try to absorb a fire hose of legal information. I mean, that would be impossible for anybody to do. The best way is to get a good foundation, get our free book, read it. It's very easy to read. Most people can read it in 3 or 4 hours. One of my regrets is we never did a graphic novel version of it, because that would be even better. But read the book, start with that foundation, and then just access our content every day and absorb it in little doses. And within a few months, you'll have a mastery of this subject matter. It's not rocket science, folks. What I do is not super complicated. It's relatively simple. The problem with what I teach, the subject matter, is there's so much bad information out there. There's so much misinformation out there on the internet that people can't differentiate between what the actual law of self-defense is and what the internet law of self-defense is. And folks, when you're in court, no one gives a damn what the internet law is. No one cares what your firearms instructor taught you or what you misunderstood a statute to mean. None of that means anything. The only thing that counts is what the law actually is. There's not that much of that. It's not that hard to learn, but you need to be able to differentiate between that actual law and all the nonsense that's out there on the internet.
Yeah, and before you wrote the book, you talking about just an absolute. There was nothing. Well, let's back up. Moss was out there, and he had Mag 40. But I think he might have been probably the only one that was talking about it.
Yeah, and I took his course in 1996. It's because I took that course that I completely changed my legal practice to focus exclusively on use of force law. So Moss was the catalyst that put me on this path that I've now been on for some 30 years. So kudos to him. And not taking anything away from Moss, but Moss would be the first person to tell you he's not a lawyer. His background is as a career in law enforcement. So he teaches the subject from that perspective. And it's not law specific. In other words, he doesn't step through specific statutes, case law, jury instructions, and he certainly doesn't do it on a state by state basis. So we both approach use of force law. And I always tell people, folks, even if you've taken my course, even if you've taken my instructor program, which is the equivalent of a law school semester-long course in self-defense law, you ought also take Moss's course. It's not duplicative. It's complementary. So if you have the opportunity, I would certainly urge everyone to take that, any one of his courses that he teaches, but at least the Mag 20 or the Mag 40 course is well worth taking. Because we teach it from different perspectives. He teaches it from a more generalized perspective, that of a law enforcement officer. And of course, I teach it from my perspective as an attorney.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that, so what, with the advent of concealed carry, now you and I remember back in, when Tennessee, I think, created their license to carry concealed firearms, it was like 1995, and Seeklander and I had just gotten out of the Marine Corps. We ran to the courthouse and got our concealed carry, and we've been carrying since then. But prior to that, you weren't really running around with concealed handguns back in the day. People don't really realize it's a relatively new phenomenon. It's only been going on for about two or 3 decades at most. What advice would you give to that new guy or gal, Andrew, that's gone out and got their concealed carry?
Well, I get in trouble on this topic because a lot of instructors, of course, they want people to take instruction naturally. And I don't mean they want that from self-serving purposes, but because more instruction is better. The more skilled you are, the more likely you are to win the fight, the more likely you are to do it in a lawful way. I also think more instruction is better. I encourage people to take instruction. Where I get caught up is I would never make that a condition of their privilege to have the weapon in the first place. Assuming, of course, they're law-abiding, mentally sound American citizens. I think, well, The Second Amendment says it shall not be infringed or ought not be any conditions for law-abiding, mentally sound American citizens to be in possession of arms. Most people who defend themselves with guns have effectively zero training. None. No tactical training, no legal training. That's not a good position to be in. But most of them win their fights because they have the gun. So to my mind, the most important thing is assuming, of course, you've got the safety instruction. So you're not going to shoot yourself or someone you love with the gun. That's got to be the top priority. But assuming you're safe with the gun, have the gun. That's the first thing. And then immediately go get instruction on how to run that gun. And hopefully get some instruction on the legal boundaries for the use of that gun as well.
I think that's interesting. I watched your show yesterday, Andrew, and you mentioned that Kyle Rittenhouse, prior to using his AR-15 defensively, had, I think, only fired it one other time.
One time. Yeah. Amazing. Right. Amazing. But that's a testament to how the utility of that platform, that AR platform. I mean, when my daughter was 9 or 10 years old, she was shooting our ARs. It's so easy to use, especially in a defensive context. In any real self-defense context, the range is so short that you're not going to miss with an AR. You just have to, I'm going to get in trouble again, but, point it in the general direction at any close personal self-defense distance, and the prospects of getting a hit are pretty darn good with an AR. It's really easy to miss with a handgun. Even close, it's easy to miss. But the utility of that AR platform, any kind of long gun platform, but especially the AR, is unbelievable. And it's a testament to it that Kyle Rittenhouse was as successful. I mean, he fought off 3 deadly force attacks within a course of minutes with an AR platform he'd only ever fired once before. That's incredible. And
his shooting, I mean, to do that as discriminatingly as he was, I mean, he didn't fire into the crowd. Each round had a name on it.
Wasn't just a mag dump.
No, it was not. Jared asked a great question. He says, how do you see the new woke movement affecting future self-defense law? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, what we're seeing, of course, is an increasing number and frequency of politicized prosecutions. And this maybe didn't quite begin with the George Zimmerman case, but that was certainly a threshold case where literally, folks, I can tell you that George Zimmerman did nothing legally wrong that night in defending himself against Trayvon Martin. That's why he wasn't prosecuted by the local authorities. It wasn't until a prosecutor was brought in from out of the district because of the political propaganda that had been built around the case, the marches that were taking place. And that particular prosecutor was running for re-election in a largely black district, was not going to win re-election because she had done some very unpopular prosecutions of black people in her district. And then she saw the shooting of Trayvon Martin. She thought, oh, here's a way for me to get back in favor with the demographic of my constituents. And she prosecuted George Zimmerman, despite there being really no evidence inconsistent with self-defense in the case at all. Even the probable cause statement, the information, the sworn information they used to drag him into court in the first place was full of lies. That's the only reason they were able to get him into court. And of course, I watched every minute of that trial, wrote about it every minute, every day. And every day, because I was naive to this at the time, I thought, well, surely if they dragged him into court, he must have done something wrong. And every day I'm watching the trial, and every day I'm waiting for the prosecution to show that evidence of malice, because they charged him with second-degree malice murder. And it never happened. In fact, the state's evidence, their witnesses, supported the self-defense narrative of the defense. It was unbelievable to watch. And unfortunately, there's a lot of money to be made in these kinds of cases, especially, this didn't happen in Zimmerman, but they've gotten more sophisticated. Mostly now they focus on police use of force cases. Those tend to be the ones that are most propagandized. And the reason for that is that's where the money is. If a police officer is involved, then you have a federal, they call it a Section 1983 lawsuit against the officer, really against the officer's department. And the department then is to settle the suit. They're spending other people's money to make a political problem go away. So the money flows. I mean, we all heard in the recent Derek Chauvin trial, for example, that George Floyd's family got $27 million from the city over that event. That is a lot of money, and a third of that at least goes to the lawyers involved, and it's always the same lawyers involved in these cases. They've built quite a practice for themselves, and every time they do it, every time they politicize one of these cases, and When I say they politicize it, I'm talking about independent of the legal merits of the case. It doesn't matter whether the case has merit or not. All that matters is that they can politicize it. They can make it uncomfortable for the politicians who have the purse strings of the taxpayer, who will be willing to spend other people's money to make a political problem go away. They make 10 million here, 15 million there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. And as long as there's that much money behind these kinds of cases, they're not going away.
No, they're not going to go away. And let's talk about that for just a moment. You mentioned George Zimmerman, and something I believe I've heard you say before, Andrew, is that the punishment is the process. If you look at the statute law, I think anybody that had read into Zimmerman a little bit, I remember when it first came out, right, this narrative of Skittles and a thing of tea, and he's shot for being black, coming back into a mostly white suburb. And I just remember being like, oh my God, this is horrific.
Sounds terrible, right?
Sounds terrible. And then when you really start getting the real story, you're like, okay, well, this is, I think, awful but lawful. One of those cases where it's like, man, this is really tragic. But again, it's a case brought about by Trayvon's conduct. And can you talk to the idea that some of these politically motivated prosecutors will often just drag you through the process to make it the punishment?
Yeah. So in theory, there's gateways that exist before you actually find yourself in trial, right? So some event occurs, there's an investigation, they look at the facts, hopefully in the context of the applicable law, and they begin to make determinations about whether or not they believe, the investigators believe, the prosecutors believe that your use of force was criminal or not. So they can come to an opinion about that. But in theory, before they can move from having an opinion about it to pulling you into court, they have to meet certain legal thresholds. There has to be probable cause to believe that the use of force was unlawful. They're supposed to have to convince a grand jury of that. Then even after convincing a grand jury and getting an indictment, they still have to convince the trial judge that probable cause exists to support these charges. Unfortunately, the concept has been so watered down that almost anything now qualifies to drag someone into court. And the difference between the pretrial status, where they're deciding whether or not to take you into court, and actually going to trial, the pain and financial cost associated with that is absolutely tremendous. So what should happen if there's a marginal case of self-defense, maybe they're not sure, but they know if they go to trial, they're going to have to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. A responsible prosecutor will look at the facts, look at the law, and if it looks like, this doesn't really look like we can disprove it by 90%, disprove it by 95%. So we're not going to take this to trial, because what would be the point if we don't actually believe we can win? Unfortunately, sometimes the reward, the benefit for the prosecutor is not actually the win. They may have no expectation of getting a win at trial. Their reward for taking the case to trial is political capital. They'll get the goodwill of the community for having taken this to trial. And there's no downside for them. So the prosecutor doesn't lose anything. He's just going to be in court anyway, right? If not on this case and some other case, this is just going to work for him. This is what he normally does. So there's no negative downside for him to take these cases into trial, even if the only reason and the only expected benefit is not a conviction, but just gained political capital. And the cost to the defendant is catastrophic. Folks, if you shoot someone in self-defense and they die and you're charged with murder or manslaughter, and it could be completely meritorious on the legal merits, your use of force was lawful, they can drag you into court anyway. And if they do that, it's easy to burn through a couple $100,000 in legal defenses before you get to trial, just pre-trial expense, and then whatever the trial costs. I mean, in the case of George Zimmerman, his trial billables were somewhere between $1.8, $2.2 million, folks. And listen, if you don't have that money, and of course most people don't, well, then you fight the battle with the legal battle with the money that you have. But that's not a great place to be. I mean, just compare it to a physical battle, right? Armies fighting. You don't want to be the army that doesn't have the resources that the other side has. And for all practical purposes, the prosecution has unlimited resources. So to get back to your point, there's supposed to be this threshold where they show probable cause. In theory, it's more probable than not that you committed the crime before they can drag you into trial. But it just doesn't work that way. The trial courts accept almost any argument by the prosecution as sufficient to pull you into court. Grand juries issue indictments like drug dealers giving away samples. We've all heard the expression that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And frankly, it's understandable because grand juries really only hear one side of the story. They only hear the prosecutor's side of the story. The defense doesn't really have a role in front of the grand jury. And if reasonable people only hear one side of the story, well, that tends to sound pretty compelling. Then, of course, we get into trial where it's an adversarial process where both sides are argued, like in the Zimmerman case. And suddenly people are shocked that there was an acquittal because, of course, the public during the trial, they also only heard one side of the story. They also only heard the story consistent with guilt. And so when there's an acquittal, it feels like an outrageous injustice to them. Not because they're bad people, but because they've been so misinformed and so propagandized. I mean, there are people today. I'll give an example. TC's here. TC was very kind enough to get me a couple speaking slots at the FBI Academy for their National Academy organization. And I'm there talking about these controversial cases, including the George Zimmerman case. And this is in front of their big auditorium, 200 or 300 people there, FBI officers, senior law enforcement officers from all over the country. And I'll ask them, the audience, how many people think George Zimmerman did X? How many people think George Zimmerman got out of his car after being told by the dispatcher not to get out of his car? And every hand goes up because they've heard that 1,000 times in the media. And they've told other people that. Importantly, this is important because it makes them emotionally committed to this narrative personally. Every hand goes up. And then I'll play the 911 call for them, the recording. And at no point is Zimmerman told not to get out of his car. It doesn't happen, folks. It's a complete fabrication. But you can see on their faces that even with that incontrovertible evidence that it never happened, they can't accept that what they believe to be the true narrative about the case is not true. They still can't absorb it. It's information just bouncing off them. And if that's the case with, let's face it, career hardened law enforcement officers, what's the general public supposed to do? I mean, of course they believe what they read in the newspapers 1,000 times. So they get this very biased narrative and perspective of these cases. And it's a travesty because then when the person's acquitted, they can almost never have a normal life again. Like George Zimmerman, only now, I have occasional contact with George. I didn't know him at the time of the trial, but I have since. He's kind of getting back a normal life now, beginning to. Folks, it's been a decade.
Yeah. Yeah, I messaged with him probably about 2 weeks ago. He came on and it was just happened to be in the comments thread, and he and I started communicating, and I invited him to come on the show. He's like, I'm trying to get my life back and retire this George Zimmerman personality. And I'm like, hey man, you deserve to find peace if anybody does. So, one of the things that Michael asked, he says, how do we hold rogue lawyers accountable? And I think that also speaks to Tony's point about prosecutors need to lose absolute immunity. And then there would be fewer political prosecutions. What do you think about that, Andrew?
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem. So traditionally, prosecutors have enormous, really unlimited discretion in their charging decisions, and they effectively have absolute immunity from any kind of liability for any decisions they make as prosecutors. And that's a system, from my perspective as a career in criminal defense law, I see that prosecutors need a lot of discretion. I get it. I understand it. I think it would be very difficult to do their jobs if they didn't have that kind of discretion. And traditionally, we've provided that kind of discretion to them. And that works very well when you have responsible and disciplined prosecutors whose primary concern is the legal merits of the case. Unfortunately, we're now in an era where certain parties in politics have discovered how inexpensive it is to purchase a prosecutor's office. Folks, most prosecutors are elected. They have a race. Usually the people running for the seat are longstanding members of the legal community, older guys or gals. Everybody in the legal community knows them. They're very familiar faces. It hardly matters which of them ends up getting the office, except for them personally. They might spend a few $1,000s each running for the elected office of prosecutor in that district. But now we have people coming in and dropping $500,000 in these races. And if one candidate has $500,000 and the other one has $5,000, who gets elected? Yeah. It's the person with the money. And these are not well-respected, long-standing members of the legal community. These are typically outliers from the community Nobody really knows who they are. They're there for completely political reasons. They couldn't care less about the legal merits of the case. But they have all the power of this discretion that we've normally provided to responsible prosecutors. And of course, when you give great power to politically motivated people, you get politically motivated prosecutions. That's just the way the system works. And the only real solution under our current system is for the people in the district, the constituency, to know who's getting elected to these offices. But I bet most of the people who are watching this show in these comments have no idea who their local prosecutor is. And that's okay if we lived in a world where you could just assume your prosecutor was a disciplined guy or gal concerned about the legal merits. By the way, increasingly, even if your local prosecutor is that disciplined, responsible person, increasingly we see cases now where the actual prosecution is taken away from the local prosecutor.
That's right.
And handed to some prosecutor who's brought in from a different district who's not that guy you voted for. This happened in the Zimmerman case. The local prosecutor actually quit rather than prosecute George Zimmerman because it was so clear that it was a legitimate case of self-defense. But that didn't save George Zimmerman. They just brought in Angela Corey from the Jacksonville district, and she was happy to prosecute him. That's happening in the McMichaels case, in the Ahmaud Arbery case. I refer to it. Of course, he's not being tried. He died in the course of those events. But the two McMichaels and Roddy Bryan, they went through 3 local prosecutors declined to prosecute that case until it got politically energized, and then they brought a prosecutor in from outside the district. So unfortunately, even if on a local level, you know your prosecutor, you elect someone responsible, that doesn't necessarily save you from a politically motivated prosecution. Not to mention, of course, if things go to the federal level.
Well, and I will tell you, having been a law enforcement officer and an investigator in the Marine Corps, to speak to Andrew's point about the deep pockets. I mean, I have conducted investigation, and I can't remember how many states and U.S. territories, and it was a limitless budget when the higher ups really wanted to go after somebody. There was almost no limit. And the other thing about, stacking charges, and I guess we could talk about this in relation to Kyle Rittenhouse, the ability to stack charges one upon another is absolutely incredible. I could charge people if you spit on the sidewalk as you walked across in the course of committing whatever crime you committed, you're going to read about it in your charging documents. Would you agree with that?
I certainly would. And of course, I see it all the time. I mean, they've charged Rittenhouse, for example, with intentional homicide, reckless endangerment, all very serious felonies. I mean, some of these charges are life in prison, by the way, plus 5 years for the gun enhancement, the sentencing enhancement. So you get life, and when you die, I guess they give you another 5 years. I mean, it's crazy. But even a lot of the other charges are 60 years plus 5 for the gun. But even with all that, then they have to tack on a misdemeanor gun charge because they purport he was in unlawful possession of that AR. Now, frankly, I've looked at Wisconsin gun law on this issue. It's somewhat convoluted. It's one statute refers to another statute refers to another statute. So it's not straightforward. But if you step through that analysis, I don't see any rational basis on which he violated gun law in Wisconsin. It looks to me like per Wisconsin gun law, he was perfectly entitled to be in possession of that weapon. And the fact that they're stacking on what I would call this kind of petty misdemeanor charge tells me they don't have confidence in their actual higher charges. Because if you know or believe that you can convict a guy on a charge carrying a sentence of life, you're not worried about a Class A misdemeanor with 9 months in jail and a $10,000 fine.
I totally agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. And I think he swept somebody with his muzzle in the course of lawful self-defense, in my opinion. And I think they charged him. And even though there's no victim, I don't think they could find the victim. Am I correct in that? Yeah,
he's facing two charges of reckless endangerment. One before, and they're not very specific about the factual basis for these charges when you look at the charging document. But the way they're describing it appears that he may have muzzled a journalist who was there, Richard McGinnis, and then he may have muzzled some other person who they don't name. They just call unknown male. So they're charging him with reckless endangerment of an unknown male. They don't even really have a victim for that charge. But I believe those charges carry a possible sentence of 60 years plus 5 years for having used the gun. So they're extremely serious charges. And a lot of times they'll layer up these charges because they're hoping that even if they can't, again, this is because they lack confidence in the murder charge, in the most serious charge. If they had confidence in that, they wouldn't worry about these other things. But if they lack confidence in that, and they ought to lack confidence in all these, so the reckless endangerment, these are not crimes of intent, right? These are crimes of recklessness. You didn't intend to muzzle the person, but you acted in a reckless manner. The actual use of force charges, the murder, the attempted murder charges, those are all intentional charges. But in every one of those incidents, all three of those people that he actually shot, that he actually used force against, he was in flight from them when they attacked him. And it's all on video. So I think the prosecution reasonably believes they're going to have an uphill fight in front of a jury on those charges, as they ought to, assuming, of course, they get anything like an impartial, unbiased jury in the first place, which is a completely different question. So they're adding these other reckless endangerment charges and these misdemeanor gun possession charges, again, because they don't have confidence in any of these things.
Let's talk about the killing charges with regard to Kyle Rittenhouse, Andrew, because I think you're right. A lot of these, and I hate to say it because it's so insensitive, but these ankle biter charges that are being layered on are somewhat irrelevant if he gets hit with one of the murder charges. Can we talk to some of the killing charges and perhaps whether you feel they're legally valid or not?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't, again, because he was so clearly in flight from the people attacking him. These are textbook cases of self-defense against life-threatening attack in each and every instance. And I know there's a tendency for people, because, again, the media picks a side, and they've clearly picked the side of Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and not the side of Kyle Rittenhouse here. So they continue to disseminate a narrative to make Rittenhouse look somehow guilty, which again is an uphill battle if you've watched the video for any of these intentional use of force charges, the killing or the murder or attempted murder charges. So they'll argue things like, well, he can't argue self-defense because he went there with a gun. But that's not a crime to go there with a gun. And by the way, even if that was a crime, say even if he was guilty of the gun possession charge, which I don't believe to be the case, but let's pretend that he's guilty of the gun possession charge, that because he was 17 years old, it was illegal for him to be walking around in public with that AR platform. That has nothing to do with the merits of his self-defense claim. It's a completely separate thing. You don't lose self-defense because you're committing some unrelated non-use of force offense in a separate legal context. So he could, in theory, be guilty of the gun charge, and that's got nothing to do with in any way undermining the merits of his self-defense cases.
But can I pause you right there, Andrew? Because
Sure.
I want to ask us, as I understand some of these laws that we call stand your ground laws, for lack of a better term, am I misunderstanding that? I thought in some of those instances, like if you were in the middle of your drug dealing, your lifestyle is you're a drug dealer, and you try to claim, use a firearm, you try to claim self-defense law, you could lose that. Am I wrong in that?
So there are some states that make self-defense conditional on not being engaged in unlawful conduct, period. And that would be the kind of scenario you're talking about. So someone's involved in a drug deal and they're attacked. Drug dealers are robbed all the time, folks, because they have things people like. They have drugs and money, right? So they're frequent targets of attack. So they're typically armed because of that. And someone could be a street corner drug dealer, and someone tries to commit an armed robbery of them, and they pull their own gun and they defend themselves like anyone else might defend against an armed robbery. In most states, the fact that they were engaged in drug dealing does not lose them self-defense. They're still entitled to defend themselves against that armed robbery. Now, they're on the hook for whatever the drug charge is. That doesn't change. But they haven't lost self-defense simply because they were otherwise engaged in some criminal activity. Unless, of course, the criminal activity is what triggered the use of force. So normally, for example, if someone goes into a liquor store, points a gun at the clerk, and is committing an armed robbery, well, that loses him self-defense. He's the first person to threaten or use unlawful force. He doesn't have a self-defense claim. But normally, if you're just selling drugs to people, you're not engaged in the use of force. You're engaged in, an unlawful, but a form of commerce. There are a few states that do condition self-defense on not being engaged in unlawful conduct at all. And in those minority of states, the drug dealing would lose you self-defense. But Wisconsin's not one of those states.
Gotcha.
So it wouldn't apply in the Rittenhouse case.
Okay. So irregardless, he's out there. He's 17 years old, carrying an AR-15. Tell us from there, Andrew, please.
One of the interesting things that so there was a recent, just a couple weeks ago, pre-trial evidentiary hearing in this case, and it went on for almost 3 hours, and over the course of that 3 hours, the prosecutor made a lot of arguments about basically how Kyle Rittenhouse was a bad character, and one of the arguments he made was, "Hey, look, he was walking around with an AR openly." And there were other people at that rally who had like Glock pistols they were carrying concealed. And, those people, they're not triggering others, right? No one's aware that they have a gun, so they're not triggering some kind of assaultive behavior. But if you're walking around with an AR, everyone sees you have a gun. And the implication appeared to be that, hey, Kyle didn't have to have an AR. He could have been walking around with a Glock instead under a coat. Nobody would have known about it. And it really struck me because it's such an incredibly specious argument because Kyle was 17. There's no way for him to lawfully carry a concealed weapon. If he'd done what the prosecutor was saying he ought to have done, he'd have been committing a crime. He would have been committing a gun crime because he can't lawfully carry a Glock concealed. He can, under this weird version of Wisconsin gun law, carry a long gun openly. That's permitted. So he was actually, the reason he wasn't carrying a pistol concealed was because that would have been criminal conduct. He was actually doing the lawful thing. So it's very interesting. I mean, the prosecutor also argued things. Of course, they're basically arguing that Kyle was a vigilante who takes the law into his own hands. But they couldn't really come up with examples of it. And the examples they did come up with were ridiculous. So there's this video people may have seen from outside of a CVS where Kyle's not seen, but you can hear him talking. And apparently they're observing a robbery taking place in the CVS, and the robbery suspect flees the CVS. And Kyle doesn't intervene. He doesn't get out of the car. He doesn't honk the horn. He doesn't intervene in any way. All he does is call 911. And the prosecutor characterized calling 911 as Kyle Rittenhouse taking the law into his own hands and getting involved in situations where he doesn't really know what's going on. Folks, if calling 911 is taking the law into your own hands and being a vigilante, we have a real problem, because my understanding was you were supposed to call 911 when you saw something you reasonably believed was reasonable conduct, right? See something, say something. That's what we're supposed to do. And when I hear the prosecutor make those kinds of arguments, again, it's like that misdemeanor charge. It tells me he doesn't have confidence in his arguments for the more serious charges.
Yeah.
So
didn't they try to make a thing, Andrew, also out of the fact that he was carrying a fire extinguisher?
That was another thing. He was taking the law into his own hands, getting involved in situations. No one asked him to put out those fires. The prosecutor's arguing. No one asked him to get involved. He didn't have to get a fire. He didn't have to do any of that. And, folks, one of the most common things I see on gun forums and self-defense threads on social media is we'll have some horrible incident, right? We'll have some innocent victim in the street getting beat down or robbed or whatever the case might be. And you'll see a bunch of bystanders. Everyone's got their camera out. They're filming or they're just walking away. And the comments are full of outrage. Why didn't they do something? Why didn't they intervene? Why did they just stand there and let this poor innocent person be victimized? And there's nothing wrong with that perspective, folks. I completely get it. But I would suggest that perhaps one of the reasons people are not intervening is because of cases like George Zimmerman, Ahmaud Arbery, Kyle Rittenhouse, because all of those defendants will tell you, we were just trying to do the right thing. Zimmerman was just a neighborhood watch volunteer who saw something suspicious. The McMichaels in the Arbery case, their defense is going to be, hey, we saw what we believe to be a felony robbery and the suspect in flight. And Georgia law, at least the Georgia law as it existed then, the citizen's arrest law allows you to make a citizen's arrest of a suspected felon in flight. And of course, Kyle Rittenhouse is saying, hey, I was just there to protect property and had a gun in case I needed to protect myself because violence was occurring. I was there to provide first aid. And he'll say, I never fired a shot except when I was attacked by these people. But all these people now, their lives are in peril. Zimmerman got acquitted at great expense and great tragic effect on his life for many years. The McMichaels, it seems to me, are likely to get convicted regardless of the legal merits. I think Rittenhouse is in a stronger position, but he's being charged for crimes that could put him in a cage. 17 years old when this happened, 18 years old now. He's looking at the rest of his life in a cage if they get this conviction. And any rational person could look at those consequences and say to themselves, you know what? I'm not intervening on behalf of a stranger. If someone attacks me, sure. Someone attacks my family, sure. If someone attacks other people, they better have brought their own damn gun because they're not my responsibility.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I tell you, but one of the things I think we see with the Ferguson effect, and that Ferguson effect, of course, is the withdrawal of the police and not wanting to take proactive action in the community, is I think we're going to see more people like Kyle Rittenhouse that try to fill that vacuum, and they do that at their own peril, that's for sure.
Well, one of the reasons, of course, that Rittenhouse is being prosecuted so vigorously is because of the politics around the case. So this was these were riots being fomented by one political side. And they were doing it all over the country, burning stuff down, all of this, basically seizing control of these city centers. And that political side knows that if it's perceived as being permissible for the other political side to show up with guns and defend their property and defend their lives and kill them if necessary, it's going to be very difficult to recruit new rioters. Right? These people are rioting largely because it appears to be consequence-free for them. They're not being prosecuted. They're not being convicted for this arson, for this property damage, for the physical injuries they're talking to people. It's consequence-free. If Kyle Rittenhouse is allowed to do this, defend himself in the midst of these riots, it's not consequence-free anymore. I mean, you could lose your life engaging in this conduct, and arguably appropriately so. So they have to go after him because they can't allow another 1,000 Kyle Rittenhouses to show up every time they want to burn down a city.
Yeah. So you're about to consume your life, Andrew, with watching every bit of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. From what you've seen thus far, does it look like any of the killing charges will stick?
Well, they ought not. Of course, a big variable here is he going to get anything like an impartial jury? I mean, the jury selection process in the Derek Chauvin case, for example, was just a travesty. These people, the jury pool, had been subject to, a year more of relentless propaganda. They lived in the city. They went by the block where George Floyd died. They saw it was now George Floyd Square. It's basically blocked off from traffic, and it's a major thoroughfare through the city. So it's not something that can go unobserved. They see all the graffiti. They get to the courthouse, and there's National Guardsmen there, and there's concrete barriers, and there's barbed wire, and they're escorted to the jury room by security with machine guns, as they describe it. This is clearly not normal, and every one of them knows that eventually, if they're selected for the jury, eventually their name will be public. And if there's an acquittal, that means every single juror voted for acquittal. So none of them can go home and say, hey, I voted guilty, but I was overruled by the others. It's unanimous. And it would take an exceptional strength of character to vote not guilty on the legal merits in such a politically charged case, knowing that your life could well be destroyed forever once you leave that trial and head back to your normal life. I think it's unreasonable to expect that of people who, let's face it, they didn't volunteer for jury duty. They were called. It was a duty as a citizen to show up. And now they're faced with this dilemma. And it's unfortunate, but I think not necessarily unreasonable for individual jurors to say, listen, I'm sorry this is happening to this guy, but I had nothing to do with any of this. And I'm not going to destroy my life, my wife's life, my kids' lives over this case. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. So at the very least, they should have, of course, changed venue on this case. It was insane to hold this trial a few blocks from where the event happened, where everyone has personal exposure to all these political dynamics. And the judge didn't change venue in that case because the judge said, well, listen, no matter where in the state we hold the trial, people are going to be aware of what happened, and we'll still have protesters. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. At the very least, I think he should have made the effort, and we'll see whether or not it would be the same. But ultimately, from my perspective, the standard ought to be that the defendant has an absolute right to an impartial trial. And if the state is unable to provide that, the state ought not try him. I don't think the solution to not being able to provide a fair trial is to just provide an unfair trial. But that's exactly what happened in that case. And that could happen in the Rittenhouse case. I mean, we'll see during the jury selection process how rigorous the judge is about excluding people who have an appearance of bias. In the Chauvin case, the judge was, I mean, it was ridiculous. As long as people could tell the court, yeah, I was at this protest and I did this and I did that, everything pro George Floyd. But as long as they were willing to say the magic words, I can be impartial in this trial, the judge let him on the jury. I mean, it was obvious that they were not impartial. It was obvious that they had bias. It was ridiculous to believe that they were going to be able to set aside a year's worth of participating in protest and suddenly be impartial for this defendant in this trial. But the judge would simply allow them to sit on the jury as long as they said those magic words. That's not the right standard. Now, we'll have to see what happens with the jury selection process. I will say that the judge in this case, the Rittenhouse case, strikes me as extremely good. Very old school, very traditional, very focused on actual justice and legal merits, completely disinterested in any politics in the case at all. He's very explicit about that. So I have high hopes that there's at least a prospect that this judge, I've said from the beginning, from the first exposure I had to this judge, I think Kyle Rittenhouse got really, really lucky because, of course, there's no guarantee he'd get this particular judge. He could have gotten a judge that was amenable to political persuasion or political capital. I think he got a very good judge. Only time will tell, but that's the biggest thing he has going for him, besides, of course, the actual legal merits of his case.
Under Wisconsin law, could he have requested a bench trial with no jury?
You know, I don't know. That varies from state to state. So in some states, the defendant has an absolute right to a bench trial if they want it. This happens. This is the law in Baltimore, for example, where we had the Freddie Gray prosecutions some years back. Freddie Gray was the street corner drug dealer who got arrested in a drug sweep, put in the back of a van. And when the van arrived at its destination, he had a broken neck and died a few days later in the hospital. And 6 police officers were charged in his death with crimes as serious as murder, even though there was literally zero evidence that any officer used any unlawful force against him at all. There was no evidence, purely politically brought prosecutions. But in Baltimore, in Maryland, I should say, the defendant has an absolute right to a bench trial if they want it. The prosecution has nothing to say about it. And of course, this was very frustrating for the prosecution because, you know, the cliche is if you're innocent, you want a bench trial. Because if you're innocent, you want the judge to play the role of the jury. That's what a bench trial means. There is no jury. The judge is the finder of law and the finder of fact. And the judge is, in theory, a legal professional who'll be unlikely to be persuaded by merely rhetorical arguments by the prosecutor, who's a professional who'll focus on the actual legal merits of the case. So if you're innocent, you don't want to run the risk that a jury could be persuaded by the prosecution by fancy words. So you want a bench trial. Conversely, if you're guilty, you want a jury because you're hoping to convince one of the jurors to vote not guilty, and then at least you have a hung jury. So in Maryland, you can demand a bench trial, and then you get it, and the prosecution there's nothing they can do about it. In other states, however, the prosecution has to agree. So in essence, in those other states, the prosecution is seen to have a right to a jury as well, if they want to argue to one. I haven't looked to see what the law is in Wisconsin, but of course it's very hazardous. It's because then you are putting your entire fate in the hands of one person. Yeah. And if that person proves politically motivated, listen, if they want to, they'll come up with a rationale to find you guilty. It'll be word salad. It'll be nonsense, but you made that choice to put the decision in their hands. So very risky. I suspect, given who this judge is, if they had the option to demand a bench trial and get it, that they would have. I think I would have. Yeah. So I suspect that he doesn't have that authority to demand a bench trial himself, that the prosecution would have to agree. And the prosecution would never agree in this case.
Yeah, with Rittenhouse, if I was Rittenhouse, I would definitely try to get a bench trial if I could, because from what I can see, it looks pretty clean. But let's talk about Ahmaud Arbery coming up. That's another one you'll be covering, Andrew. And of course, the circumstances are vastly different than Kyle Rittenhouse. Can you talk us through what you've had been able to see from the Ahmaud Arbery shooting? Yeah.
So even in the Ahmaud Arbery case, I think given the oddities of Georgia law, that there's a very strong defense there, given the available evidence. It's a more complicated defense, I don't think really for the legal merits, but because there's a racial dynamic in this case. And it's a very powerful racial dynamic. I mean,
can you back up, perhaps, Andrew, for those that aren't familiar, we're talking about the Ahmaud Arbery shooting. Give us the meat of the case, please.
So the idea is that Ahmaud Arbery he had entered a dwelling that wasn't his. He'd unlawfully entered a dwelling. He's caught on camera inside the building. So it's incontrovertible that he was inside this house. It happens to be a house that was undergoing construction or reconstruction. So nobody was living there at the time. But he had been jogging down the street. He entered this dwelling. Then he left the dwelling and he's jogging away. Now, whether he's, the prosecution is going to argue he was recreationally jogging through the neighborhood. Of course, the defense is going to argue that he was in flight from a felony. Under Georgia law, if you unlawfully enter a dwelling, and folks, the Georgia burglary law is very broad. It applies to cars, to tool sheds, almost anything, any structure. If you unlawfully, without permission, enter that structure for the purpose of committing a crime, that's felony burglary under Georgia law. You don't have to actually steal something. So you might enter the structure with the intent to steal something, and there's nothing worth stealing. So you run away, you leave. You've still committed felony burglary. So that's part of it. So if they observed Arbery enter, and by the way, this has been a problem in that neighborhood. They had been asked, the McMichaels had been asked by the local police to keep an eye out for burglaries. So if they had observed Arbery, someone they don't know, not a member of their neighborhood, they knew the person who lived across the street from them, of course, enter the dwelling and then leave, they may have had a reasonable belief that a felony burglary had just been committed. And under a second Georgia law, Georgia's citizens arrest law, if you see a felon fleeing from an apparent felony, you are allowed to pursue that person and make a citizen's arrest. Now, that law has been revoked now, repealed, I should say, and maybe with good reason. It was a very, very broad citizens arrest law. And it dated back to 1865. It was a law that was created in a different time, in a different era, when most communities didn't have professional police departments. The citizenry was the police department. So they were given these very broad powers of citizens arrest. And maybe in modern society, we need to really constrain those citizens arrest powers. But in any case, that was the law on the books at the time of these events. So, of course, the McMichaels' defense will be, listen, we saw an apparent felony burglary. Georgia citizens arrest law says we're allowed to pursue, detain, and arrest a reasonably suspected felon. And that's what we were doing when he attacked us. Fought Travis McMichael for the shotgun. And in the course of fighting over the shotgun, that's when Travis McMichael shot Arbery in self-defense. That's going to be the defense narrative. The prosecution narrative is going to be, there's a couple racists who saw a black guy jogging recreationally through the neighborhood, chased him down with a pickup truck and shot and killed him out of racial animus. And of course, anytime you have that racial component in the case, listen, racism is bad, right? We all hate racism. It's the wrong thing to do. So if you can paint the defendant with that brush, it makes the defendant look very bad. And it also makes it very awkward for a jury to find that defendant not guilty, because nobody wants to acquit an apparent racist or be accused of acquitting apparent racist, because then you'll be painted with the racist brush as well. I mean, it's interesting because even in the Rittenhouse case, they're trying to introduce some racial dynamic there because it's so advantageous to the prosecution to be able to do that by alleging some kind of relationship between Kyle Rittenhouse and this group, the Proud Boys. And listen, I'll be the first person to say I don't really know anything about the Proud Boys. I never heard of the Proud Boys before this case. I have no idea who they are. I keep having people sending me messages. Hey, they're not a bad group. You should learn more about them. Folks, I'm not interested. I don't do politics. I just do law. Okay. But the prosecution is arguing that there's some kind of racial animus as part of the Proud Boys organization. And so they're trying to paint Kyle Rittenhouse as being associated with the Proud Boys so they can paint him as having some racial animus, even though race has nothing to do with the case. Kyle Rittenhouse is white. Everybody he shot is white. There's no race dynamic here, but it's so powerful that the prosecutor is doing everything in the Rittenhouse case that he can to try to inject it into the case. In the Ahmaud Arbery case, of course, the race is patent throughout the whole case because we have three white guys chasing a black guy down the street and ultimately shooting him with a shotgun. And if you can kind of mist over the details about who charged who attacked who, because folks, when you watch the video, at the moment of the decisive conflict, the McMichaels their pickup truck is stopped. And Travis McMichael is standing outside the door. Greg McMichael is in the bed of the pickup truck. They're not advancing on Arbery. Arbery advances on them, which you don't hear the media mention very much. When the media reports on this, they make it sound like these guys were rolling down the street in their pickup truck and just shot Arbery in the back as he was jogging on the street. That's not what happened, folks. What I see when I watch that movie is I see Ahmaud Arbery charging them. Now, maybe there's a rationale for that, but that's clearly what happened on the video.
Yeah, it is what happened on the video, and the video it could exonerate them, or it could put them away for the rest of their lives, because, well, again, what the optics are is a bunch of white rednecks in a pickup chasing a recreational jogger down a street. It's so charged. I really don't know if it's possible for them to get a fair trial.
Yeah, it's actually charged at levels I've never seen before. So, previously there were several local prosecutors who caught this case and passed it on like the hot potato it is. They all came up with excuses why it wasn't appropriate for them to try the case. They had some kind of conflict of interest. And one of those prosecutors who got the case said, "Oh, I have a conflict of interest," because Greg McMichael had worked in the prosecutor's office before. So she handed it off to another prosecutor, which is what she's supposed to do. She herself is now being prosecuted for failure to execute her legal duty as a prosecutor in the case, which is insane, because all she really did, she didn't obstruct the investigation. She didn't hide evidence. She didn't say, don't charge these people. She just said, I'm not the appropriate prosecutor, and handed it to a different prosecutor. So in no way did she inhibit prosecution of these defendants, but she's being criminally charged now. And of course, the real point of that is to send a message to every other prosecutor. Hey, if you catch a case like this, you better not recuse yourself. You better vigorously prosecute this case, or you may be facing criminal charges yourself.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Andrew. And Greg McMichael, that's the father, I believe. Doesn't he have some sort of law enforcement background or quasi law enforcement background?
So Greg McMichael, the father, definitely worked in a law enforcement capacity for a local prosecutor's office. I don't know if he had, I have a vague recollection that he might have been a normal cop before. And this is, sometimes they do this. You're a cop for 20 years and then you kind of retire, but you double dip and now you work for the prosecutor's office. So it might have been that kind of dynamic. But ironically enough, he'd previously investigated Ahmaud Arbery, either for a direct crime or as part of a pre-sentencing report or something like that. So they had some kind of, I don't know if direct interaction, but exposure, I should say, to each other. Having said that, I don't think there's any evidence that Greg McMichael had that prior exposure in mind when he decided to pursue Arbery. So I'm not sure it would actually be relevant to the facts of this case. It would be interesting, though, because I believe it was a gun case that he was investigating. So if he had recognized Arbery as Arbery was in flight, and had previous exposure to Arbery as a suspect who'd been unlawfully armed with a gun, that would explain why the McMichaels armed themselves in pursuit of Ahmaud Arbery, because they would have been aware of him as the guy who was prone to being armed.
But wouldn't it be tactically prudent if you're going to arrest someone and seize them to arm yourself prior to this, especially if you're dealing with a felon?
Well, yes. I would suggest that's kind of like a second level of prudence analysis. However, in a lot of these cases, again, the Zimmerman case, the Rittenhouse case, this Ahmaud Arbery case, a good argument could be made that, listen, regardless of the legal merits, these people are now facing severe legal jeopardy. And by the way, of course, also physical jeopardy, right? They could have been killed. Travis McMichael could have lost that fight for the shotgun.
That's right.
And then he would be dead. His father would be dead. Rittenhouse could have lost that fight in the street. All three of them been murdered. George Zimmerman could have been murdered that night in Florida. So you have the actual risk of getting into a deadly force fight that you lose. There's no magic pixie dust. That means the good guy wins the fight, folks. I don't care what your skill. We learn these self-defense skills because we want to reduce the risk of losing the physical fight as much as possible. We want to get as close to 0% losing the physical fight as possible. But it's never zero. It's always greater than zero. And it's the same for the legal fight. It's never, I don't care how innocent you are. Innocent people get convicted, folks. I don't care how innocent you are. There's always a greater than zero possibility you'll get convicted. So one might argue that the prudent person doesn't unnecessarily put himself in a position where he's now suddenly facing a greater than zero risk of death and a greater than zero risk of living in a cage for the rest of his life. George Zimmerman did nothing legally wrong, made no legal mistakes, but he made tactical mistakes. I mean, he did get out of his car. He put himself in an ambush position and he got himself ambushed. That wasn't a crime. That didn't undermine his privilege of self-defense at all. He ought still have been acquitted. But if he hadn't done that, he would never have been involved in either the physical fight or the legal fight that followed. We can argue that Kyle Rittenhouse, listen, he didn't have to go to downtown Kenosha with an AR to protect somebody's car lot. It's not his car lot. He didn't have to be there. Now, having done that doesn't lose him self-defense if somebody tries to kill him, but he would never have been in the position of having to defend himself if he'd stayed home and played on his Xbox. The McMichaels didn't have to chase Ahmaud Arbery. Right? One might argue the prudent listen, I can tell you this, I'm never going to make a citizen's arrest of anybody. That's not my job. If someone's trying to kill me or kill my family, then I'm going to defend us. But if they're in flight, that's a win as far as I'm concerned. That solved my immediate problem. So you can always argue that the prudent decision, the first level prudent decision is not to get engaged in the first place. Now, if you've decided to get engaged, well, then, yeah, I guess you have to go armed because you don't want to die. Right. So if Rittenhouse was going to go to a riot in process in Kenosha, I guess you bring a long gun. If the McMichaels are going to chase a reasonably suspected felon, I guess you arm yourself to do that, to make that arrest. But did you have to do that in the first place? Now, again, none of that loses you self-defense. They're all entitled to defend their lives against deadly force attack. So it's not really a legal question. It's kind of a more of a moral or philosophical question. Are you prepared to take those risks in order to accomplish a citizen's arrest or in order to protect a car lot? And some people are, and there's nothing morally wrong with that position. I'm not being critical of those. I don't tell people what to do. Okay, that's their choice to make. We still mostly live in a free country. You decide what you want to do. All I can do is inform you about the likely legal consequences and the obvious physical consequences of those kinds of decisions. What hill are you willing to kill over? Which ought to be largely the same as the hill you're willing to die on, right? Because that's one possible outcome of that decision. And to my mind, it ought to be a pretty darn short list. And the broader you make that list, well, the more risk you're incurring for yourself. Just if you're going to do that, just do it in an informed way.
Speaking of that, there's another racially charged shooting down in Georgia, Rayshard Brooks. Are you following that at all, Andrew?
Well, that's just an outright ridiculous case, obviously.
Yeah.
Of course, if you watch the media, it's just a white officer shot a black suspect in the back, however many times it was. Anybody who bothers looking at any of the facts of the case can clearly see that was a completely justified shooting. I mean, Brooks was armed with a knife. They keep saying he was unarmed, shot an unarmed black man. He was not unarmed, folks. You can clearly see the knife in his hands, and it's like a karambit type knife. It's a very vicious looking knife. It's not like your grandfather's little case pocket knife that he whittled wood with. This was a knife designed for physical combat with other human beings. And he's getting into a car full of children, a car that's not his. In fact, the owner of the car is the one who called police because he hadn't returned the car. He'd previously crashed other cars. An officer can't let this guy who's been threatening people armed with a knife, non-compliant with lawful police orders, get back into a car with a bunch of children and drive away. I mean, that would be insane. So it's obviously a justified shooting. But of course, it has this racial dynamic. So it'll go on and on and on. Hopefully, when the officers try, he'll get acquitted, and 95% of the world will be shocked at the acquittal because all they'll have heard is the media narrative of a black man, unarmed, shot in the back, paralyzed by a police officer for, as far as the media is concerned, no good reason. Folks, there was good reason. This was a lawful use of force by that officer.
And that was Jacob Blake that Andrew's discussing right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Rayshard Brooks. I'm sorry. I got it mixed up. Rayshard Brooks
there's
is
so
the DWI
many
case. Yeah.
But see, what's funny, if we could pause just for a moment, we being the collective Americans here. We know the names of all these. So this idea that there's just African American men and women being killed at random throughout the United States by law enforcement officers is so statistically preposterous. I mean, we can name the ones that are actually involved and and have followed the trial pretty closely. Just so it's not this idea that hundreds or thousands potentially African American men are being killed by law enforcement.
If it was a systematic institutional problem, as is claimed, there'd be hundreds and thousands of these cases. There wouldn't be 4 or 5 purported cases a year.
Yeah.
And yes, Rayshard Brooks was the DWI case down in Georgia. He basically passed out in his car outside a fast food joint. And of course, they called the police because there's a guy passed out in his car in the line for the fast food joint. The cops show up. He's drunk. They go to arrest him. 2 officers. He violently resists arrest to the point of fighting with the police on the ground, going for their weapons, gets one of their tasers, starts fleeing. And as he's in flight and one of the officers is pursuing him, Brooks turns and points the taser back at the officer. And that's when the officer shoots and kills him. Again, this is to my mind, and I've looked at the case closely, a clearly justified use of deadly defensive force by that officer. And for people who are thinking, well, it was only a taser, it's only non-deadly force. No, folks, you got to take this in the context of the totality of the circumstances. A taser used defensively is non-deadly force. A taser used offensively by a criminal suspect who's just fought police for their weapons, that's a deadly use of force because you're incapacitating the officer, assuming the taser works, which you have to assume. They often don't, but you certainly can't count on that. They're attempting to incapacitate the officer. The officer's then helpless against a violent criminal suspect who just fought them for their weapons. That's a deadly force threat, folks. So the officer was clearly justified in using deadly defensive force. And it's not like, I mean, it all happened in an instant. He saw the taser, saw it pointed at him, fired the gun. It's not like there was some big lapse in time and then the officer chose to use deadly force when it was clear there was no longer any threat. The threat was right there when the officer shot. But again, we have this racial dynamic, right? We have they'll say the officer shot this black suspect in the back.
Yeah, and that's when I saw it, because there's 2 officers. Mr. Brooks is fighting one of the officers for his firearm, and then he turns to run and points behind him. And from my years of law enforcement, as soon as Officer Rolfe, I believe, was the officer that fired the fatal shots, I assumed he was shooting at an armed suspect. I didn't realize it was a taser until you zoom in on one of the pictures. You could see this yellow object in his hand, but this officer has literally not nanoseconds, but literally milliseconds to make that terrible decision that was brought about by Mr. Brooks's conduct.
So it was clearly a weapon.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So either it was a deadly force weapon like a gun or a non-deadly force weapon like a taser. The best case scenario for the prosecution is that it was a non-deadly force weapon like a taser. Even under that circumstance, the shooting is still justified. Clearly, if it was a deadly force weapon or reasonably perceived as a deadly force weapon, then it's even more justified to use deadly defensive force.
One of the questions that I want to ask, and of course, I know you don't have a crystal ball, Andrew. I wish you did. But how will the outcomes of these trials impact the social justice movements that are going on across the United States?
I don't think it makes any difference because I don't think the point of these prosecutions is actually conviction. I mean, of course, if they get a conviction, they'll take it and they'll crow about it. They'll be very happy about it. But I think the real purpose of these prosecutions is purely political, and they get the political benefit whether or not they get the conviction. So I mentioned earlier that in the Zimmerman case, the local prosecutors wouldn't take Zimmerman to trial. It was clearly self-defense, so they had to get a prosecutor from out of the district. That prosecutor, Angela Corey, was running for re-election. She was not going to win re-election because the black people in her community didn't like her because of some unpopular prosecutions she'd made against other black people in the community. She was going to lose re-election. She prosecuted George Zimmerman for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Now, instead of protests against her in the community, she was at the head of protests. She was at the head of marches against George Zimmerman. So she was back in favor. She lost the case. George Zimmerman was acquitted. So on the legal merits, that's a loss. But she won re-election. So when people say Angela Corey lost that case, I have to ask, well, how do you define win or loss? Because if the real concern is a political concern, well, she won that fight. She won her reelection, which was, I think, the real point of their prosecution. Now, if she'd gotten a conviction, of course, she would have been very happy. But the conviction would have been icing on the cake. That wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was political capital. And I think that's the real purpose here. I think even if Rittenhouse gets acquitted, the fact that they put him through this process is going to have a chilling effect on anybody else who might want to do what Rittenhouse did. Show up as some kind of citizen militia protecting property in the face of riots. Who's going to do that if they know that even if they have all the legal merits on their side and ultimately would be acquitted at trial, they're going to have to spend a couple of their years of their life going through this kind of process? Who's going to make a citizen's arrest after the Ahmaud Arbery case? So whether or not people get convicted or not, I think is somewhat besides the point. If I'm correct that the real purpose of these things is really political and not legal.
Well, I guess my concern is, and I said this in 2020, I said, guys, don't act like the riots are over. If Kyle Rittenhouse is acquitted, we could see rioting. If Officer Rolfe is acquitted, we could see rioting again, maybe even worse than before. Because if you think back to, for those of us that are old enough to remember the Rodney King situation, the Rodney King videotape is released in March of 1990, but the riots didn't occur until the officers were acquitted. That's when the real burning and looting and deaths occurred. So I think that we could see, maybe I'm wrong, hopefully I'm wrong, that with the Jacob Blake officers and everyone involved, as these officers get acquitted, and rightfully so for most of them, I think we're going to see a lot more looting and burning. That's my opinion. What do you think?
Well, I think you're certainly right that if there's an acquittal, that can readily act as a catalyst for more rioting and looting. But I think we live in a different era than Rodney King. I don't think the catalyst is required. I mean, listen, riots and looting were happening before these trials were occurring. So there's always going to be some existing allegation of a wrongful killing that took place, either by officers or by citizens, because there's too much money to be made. So this is, you have to think of it as being orchestrated. So once one case is settled, either by an acquittal or a conviction, and whatever the immediate consequences of that are, I can assure you within 3 to 4 weeks, there'll be another one. Because we live in a country of 330 million people. There's lots of bad guys, and there's lots of cops, and there's lots of citizens, and there's lots of interactions. And they'll simply scan through the news. They'll set up a Google alert, just like I have Google alerts for these cases, and they'll see one. All right, folks, we've all had a vacation since the last propaganda effort. Everyone's back at the job now. Let's find our next news story to propagandize. And they'll just pick one because it doesn't have anything to do with the actual underlying legal merits. It just has to be a sufficient fuel to power another propaganda initiative. And then we'll just have another one. It'll be Joe Smith. It doesn't matter. We're never going to be in a time where the people who are profiting from this, both in terms of money and political capital, are simply going to say, yeah, we don't want more money. We don't want more political capital. We're just not going to do this anymore. As long as it's profitable, they're going to keep doing it. So it's never going to stop.
Well, and I think that this bifurcation of America, or whatever we're experiencing right now, from what you're saying, it seems like you see this bifurcation continuing and perhaps even growing as in the years to come. Well,
listen, like everybody, I have my own political opinions, but politics is not my area of expertise. So I'll leave that to others. Over a beer, I'm happy to share my political opinions. But in this kind of forum, I try to stick to the law. I will tell people that as politicized as these kind of cases are now, and as high a risk as there is of even a completely legally meritorious use of force case being dragged to trial, despite the legal merits of that self-defense use of force, the most important thing people like us can do for ourselves is, one, make sure you can win the fight. Right? As you guys say at AWS, the fight's coming. Are you ready? Make sure you can win the physical fight, because if you can't do that, the rest doesn't matter. But once you've done that, make sure you know where those legal boundaries, folks, are, because the worst thing you can do for yourself is use force, even with the best of intentions, 1 foot outside those legal boundaries. Because if you're facing a politically motivated prosecution, they're going to lie and they're going to fabricate, and they may hide evidence. There's all kinds of things they can do, but they don't need to do any of that if your use of force was actually unlawful. If you don't know where the legal boundaries are and you stepped 1 foot over, you just handed them your life. Because remember, when you claim self-defense, you're not saying it wasn't me, I didn't do it, I was someplace else, I have an alibi. You're saying I did it, I shot that guy, but I did it in lawful self-defense. And then it turns out you failed to check one of the boxes for lawful self-defense. That's just a confession now. So you don't really need to do anything differently when you're facing a political prosecution than a traditional prosecution in terms of the legal aspects. If anything, it's all the more important that you don't hand them an easy win. You need to make yourself as hard a prosecution as possible. If you're a hard prosecution, the chances of getting brought to trial by a traditional prosecutor is almost zero, because they like almost guaranteed wins in court. They don't like to take cases to court where the prospects of winning are less than 90%. Now, if you're dealing with a politically motivated prosecutor, they'll take you to trial anyway. They don't care about the legal merits. But still, once you get in trial, the only thing that's going to save you is that your use of force was within the legal boundaries. That's it. You have to have that, because if you don't have that, you're done. So again, I would just urge folks, at least have a foundational understanding of these legal boundaries. Folks, there's not 500 things you need to know about the law of self-defense. There's not even 50. There's only 5. Sometimes not even 5. Sometimes it's fewer than that. 5 elements of a claim of self-defense is the most. Please learn what they are, because most people who get in trouble on self-defense claims, the kind of cases I work on, not bad guy cases of self-defense, but good guy cases of self-defense. Most of those cases that I work on, they're not politically motivated. They're cases you've never heard of. These are normal, law-abiding people who've never been in trouble with the law a day in their lives, felt threatened, pulled a gun. Typically, they didn't fire a shot. Nobody was hurt. But you pull a gun on someone, that's aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unless you can justify it as self-defense. And most of the time, they're being charged and prosecuted because the prosecutor perceives a weakness in one of those 5 elements that they need. Don't do that to yourself. The defendant did that to himself. He conducted himself in a way that made him look vulnerable to successful prosecution. You don't want to be that person. You want to look like you're hard to convict because you're so far inside the legal boundaries. And you can do that and still decisively defend yourself and your family. So don't rely on hope or the goodwill of a prosecutor, because that can happen, but you're just putting your life in the hands of other people whose interests may not be aligned with your interests. Make sure you know what the law of self-defense actually is. And of course, a great way to start that is get our book for free, lawofselfdefense.com/free book. I don't know what else to tell you, folks. If you're not willing to do that and spend a little bit of time, 3 hours reading through it, well, I mean, good luck. And when you get charged, I guess, call my office.
Yeah, exactly. One of the questions I had for you, we're almost ready to wrap up, Andrew, and I thank you so much for your hour and a half that you've given us this morning. And it's a version of John's question here. So, sorry I'm late. What are the 3 most common mistakes CCW owners make? I don't really want to go into that, but I want to talk, because since you brought it up, there are 5 elements of lawful self-defense in most cases: innocence, imminence, reasonableness, avoidance, and proportionality. Is there one of those that is more tenuous than the other 5, that where you see, honestly, good guy cases miss up?
Well-intentioned defenders screw up every single one of those. There's not really one that's particularly more vulnerable to than the others are. I wish there was, and we could just focus on that one, but it's just not the case. And part of it, of course, is, in one sense, there's the truth of the element, right? Were you the aggressor? Did you use disproportional force? Those kinds of things. But in another context, it's how that element can be characterized. Can it be made to look like you were the aggressor? Can it be made to look like you used too much force? Can it be made to look like you failed to take advantage of a safe avenue of retreat? So because no one knows what actually happened in any absolute sense, right? The police who respond, they weren't there when it happened. The prosecutor certainly wasn't there. The jury wasn't there. The judge wasn't there. Nobody knows what actually happened. All anybody can do is look at the available evidence and try to make reasonable inferences from that evidence. And if the prosecutor perceives a vulnerability in one or more of those elements, well, he's going to make up word salad about how you should be denied self-defense by the jury because you failed that particular element. You want to make that rhetorical job as hard as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of people actually violate one of those elements. They are the initial aggressor, or they do use disproportional excessive force, and they make the prosecution's job easy. I mean, you've handed him your conviction. So by learning what the law of self-defense is, you at least don't do that. You at least make them work for it. And that's all you can do in the legal fight, just like in the physical fight, right? You can't make yourself immune from all harm, but you can make that bad guy work for it.
Yeah, I tell you, I'm going to say your tagline. I believe it's, you carry a gun so you're harder to kill, know the law so you're harder to convict.
Absolutely.
I absolutely love that slogan. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning, sir.
Sure thing. Anytime, Rich. Happy to be here.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I was going to ask you, what can I ask all of our guests, what can you do to make yourself harder to kill? But I think I'll answer that for you. Know the law so you're harder to convict. Andrew, where can they find your products one more time, sir, if you don't mind?
Sure. Again, to get a copy of a free copy of our book, strongly encourage you to do that. We only ask for the shipping and handling. lawofselfdefense.com/free book. And really, the best way to learn this stuff is gradually over a long period of time, get access to our members only content. You can try that out for 2 weeks for 99 cents. If you don't like it, we'll give you twice your money back. It's negative risk, folks. You really can't lose. And if you stay a member, it's less than $10 a month. It's about a quarter a day. You can do that 2-week trial for 99 cents at lawofselfdefense.com/trial. And we try to imagine the least costly ways to get this content out to everybody. Do that. It hardly costs anything, negative risk. And if you decide you don't like it, what are you out? The $8 shipping and handling and 99 cents, you haven't really lost anything. But you've gotten a low cost opportunity to see what we do, how we do it, if you want more exposure. And then it's up to you if you want to get a course or become a member or join our consult program or whatever you think is appropriate for your circumstances.
Yeah, guys, as I've said before, I'm a paid member of the consult program. I have a dog-eared copy of Andrew's book. I brought the DVD set for my son when he got his lifetime concealed carry. We sit down and watched it together. I attended Andrew's courses. I can't say enough good things about all that he does for our community. So thank you again, sir.
My pleasure, Rich. Anytime.
Guys, stay safe and remember the fight is coming. Be ready.
Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed that comprehensive interview of myself by Rich Brown of the American Warrior Society, at least as much as I enjoyed being the subject of the interview. And thanks again to Rich for having me on his Coffee with Rich show. If you have any comments on or questions about the content of the interview or would like to see more such content on the Law of Self-Defense YouTube channel, be sure to leave a comment below. And of course, be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, and click the bell to be sure to get notifications every time we upload more such content to the Law of Self-Defense YouTube channel. In closing, remember, if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law so you're hard to convict. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Stay safe.